Professor Bruce Cain, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. Many scholars locate the transformation of the American right within long-term structural changes dating back to the 70s, such as realignments in race, region, and party organization, while others highlight the Trump and MAGA era as a moment of acute disruption. How do you conceptually distinguish between this deeper ideological and institutional evolutions and the more contingent, charismatic, and stylistic ruptures introduced by Trump?
This is a really important point that you're making, which is that because Trump sucks all the oxygen out of conversation, people tend to think that everything has to do with Trump and his personality and his adroit using of social media. But I think it is absolutely important to emphasize that there were larger demographic and political trends behind Trumpism. And I would, because the list is very long, just put it down to a couple that are particularly important. One is what we call social sorting, meaning that America is a very mobile society. And because it's very mobile, we've had a lot of states and rural and urban areas that have come to reflect the partisan makeup of different parties. And so we have heavily Democratic areas in urban areas and heavily Republican areas and rural areas. And so this is partly enabled by the fact that people tend to move into neighborhoods with other people like themselves. And so you end up getting social sorting that reinforces what goes on online when people similarly find their way into virtual groups that are similar to their own demography. The second thing is what we call party sorting in political science, meaning that the coalitions underwent a sorting process starting in the 60s and 70s with the signing of the civil rights legislation. And from that period forward, the Democratic Party, which had been a coalition of sort of liberal elites in blue areas and, if you like, very conservative, racially conservative Southern Democrats, that coalition broke apart. And essentially the conservative, social conservatives, the racial conservatives in particular, went over to the Republican Party, and the liberal Republicans went over to the Democratic Party. And so the parties now, instead of being more heterogeneous and having internal breaks within their coalitional structures, became more ideologically consistent in terms of social and political liberalism or conservatism. And then there are things that are outside the political process per se, although they're a function of some of the policies we passed, which is incredible amount of rising inequality, largely based on education, as the American economy became very service-oriented and very high-tech oriented. Immigration policies that changed during the civil rights era to be open to groups from all over the world, which increased the racial diversity of the United States. That trend just continues, partly because of once immigrant groups get here, they tend to have higher birth rates. And so even if you close off the immigration, the diversity continues. And then just residual racial tensions from the earlier period, particularly around African Americans and to some degree Latinos. So yes, Trump made things worse, but absolutely there were demographic and political trends that preceded this that make it possible for him.
Right. The contemporary Republican coalition increasingly rests on rural, white, non-college educated constituencies mobilized through identity-based appeals rather than policy commitments. How has this demographic and geographic consolidation reshaped the movement's ideological core, and to what extent has the strategic shift toward cultural grievance politics weakened traditional party mediation and fostered extra-institutional ecosystems like the alt-right and online mobilization networks?
Yes, and again, this is another one of these underlying trends that really is so critical. I'm an old man, and when I was growing up, there was more of a working class versus non-working class managerial divide in American politics. And today it's much more college educated versus not college educated. And the problem for the Democratic Party is that while there are a large number of college educated people in the United States, the percent of people who've graduated from college is about 37%, and those who do not have a college education, it's about 60%. So what that means is that as we moved away from manufacturing, particularly in the middle of the country, we were taking a whole bunch of jobs, union jobs and well-paying non-white collar jobs, and we were giving them over to other countries. And that our free trade policies were undermining not only the economic basis of the middle of the country, but also of blue collar workers throughout the United States. And I believe one element of this is just the anger about downward social mobility on the part of people that do not have a university education. But you also mentioned, and I think it's right to say, that there's been a shift in terms of cultural grievance. Part of that is that along with the economic downward mobility comes social and political loss of power, loss of status, and that certainly contributes to the grievance that you're talking about. But there was also the fact that the court got way out ahead of on abortion policy and took it away from the states and sort of nationalized a policy I tend to agree with, but nonetheless, many Catholics and many fundamentalist Protestant groups don't agree with, which is the right to abortion. And abortion really played a major role in, on top of the racial divisions, in creating a divide between the Democratic and Republican Party. So yes, absolutely, I think grievance politics is now a very important part of what we're talking about here.
Right. Trump's response to events such as the Charlie Kirk assassination reveals how crisis can be harnessed to justify extraordinary measures. How would you situate Trump's use of crisis narratives within classical authoritarian playbooks such as Reichstag fire strategies? And do you see this as a deliberate authoritarian project or an improvisational, charismatic populism that nonetheless has authoritarian consequences?
Yeah, that involves psychoanalyzing Mr. Trump, which unfortunately I can't do. I think some of it is absolutely a deliberate strategy, but some of it is just that this is not a man who controls his emotions very well. And maybe if he's going to follow the path of his father into dementia, we may see more of this kind of emotional roller coaster because that's one of the features of dementia. So believe me, we're worried about that in the United States. Um, there's no question that whether it's by instinct or by thought out strategy, Trump is playing the classical authoritarian game. There's just no doubt that that's what he's trying to do. It suits the way he's run his companies, it suits the people that he admires from other countries, the leaders he admires. So he's following their footsteps, basically. But I will say this. So far, he is tracking the other presidents, the three presidential administrations, including Trump 1, in terms of his popularity with the public. His numbers have been dropping. He's now at about 41% favorability, which is where he was in Trump 1 when he when he had a huge setback in the by-election that followed his election in 2016. There are a lot more courts now, particularly below the Supreme Court level, that are stopping his efforts to do authoritarian things, whether it's with the troops or whether it's with emergency clauses. Now, admittedly, we still have to wait for the Supreme Court to weigh in on this, but if it seems like the Supreme Court is waiting to hear from many of the district and appellate courts. So I think if I were the Trump administration, I would suspect that he's going to lose a fair number of these cases. And then, of course, the press corps increasingly are mad at him, and most recently, when the Defense Department tried to get them to sign pledges not to use leaked information. Pretty much all the press, including the right-wing press, went out against him. So yes, there's no question that he wants to play the authoritarian playbook. The question is whether it's possible in the United States, even in these very divided times.
Right. Do you view the MAGA movement as populism evolving toward a stable authoritarian formation, potentially institutionalized through mechanisms like Project 2025, or as a personalist phenomenon tied to Trump's leadership that may dissipate with his exit? What institutional or cultural legacies do you expect to persist beyond his tenure?
Again, it's a mix. You can't take Trump out of the equation. His ability to use social media, the fact that he's a self-financed candidate and was able to start his candidacy with his money, and the fact that he had been a TV star in a show which demonstrated his, strong leadership in business, even if we think it was all fake. All those things definitely were. It's not clear that anybody else could have brought all those things together. So the uniqueness of Trump in that dimension. But the reality is that there was the between people that were unhappy about many of the social issues we were talking about and people that were downwardly mobile, there was always a potential to use the base, which we now call the Make American Great Again base, the MAGA base. That base is really a critical part of this, and that base probably won't go away, even if Trump, decides to, not contest the election, the next presidential election, because he thinks he can run a third time. The Constitution says no, but the MAGA base will stay no matter what happens to Trump. And the other problem that we have is that there's really close contestation between the two parties. A lot of our most stable periods have been when one party or the other was more dominant. So if you go back into the 60s and 70s, it was the Democratic Party, and you go back to the Reagan years, it was the Republican Party. But neither party has a really strong grip right now, which means we're going to have a lot of seesawing back and forth, a lot of closely contested elections, which brings in a lot of mischief as people try to, get the tactical and strategic advantage out of the system. So yes, a lot of it will stay on even though Trump moves, but Trump, I think, does bring a unique element to it that I don't see anybody else in the Republican Party able to duplicate.
Right. Trump's willingness to deploy more National Guard in major Democratic-run cities raises questions about federal coercion, politicization of armed forces, and the subversion of local democratic autonomy. How might such measures operate within an authoritarian power consolidation strategy, particularly in delegitimizing urban, racially diverse political centers framed as internal enemies?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're worried about that. There's no question that what's different about Trump is this attempt to try to incite division as opposed to suppress it or mediate it, and this attempt to sort of use extra controversy, to go around the rules in dubious ways and wait for the court to actually, slap his hand. And the court, of course, is very deliberate. It's going to look at these things very closely before it makes decisions that will affect the future. And so this is what's troubling is this, as compared to Trump 1, there's much more bullying. There was always a bullying element in Trump 1, but he's really taken that one step further, and he's really taking it into the states, which is a big no-no in America. That would be the equivalent of the EU coming into Spain and into France and into other countries in Europe and bringing the military to enforce policies of the EU. I mean, we believe that states have sovereign powers over things like education and police and fire and local services. And for Trump to be coercing people at that level is very disturbing, very unusual. I think it will ultimately be defeated by the courts, but it's going to take a while before these things finally get litigated.
Right. White replacement and white genocide conspiracies have become central to far-right mobilization. How integral are these narratives to sustaining the contemporary Republican coalition, and how do they interact with institutional party strategies versus grassroots extremist currents?
I think for the MAGA base, they're absolutely essential. And the MAGA base is maybe at best 40%, but more likely 30% of the Republican Party support. I don't believe that the white replacement and white genocide conspiracies are affecting traditional Republicans. I think the part of it that they may be resonating with is the concern about perhaps overly zealous efforts to do diversity, inclusion, and equity, the DEI issues. But that doesn't mean that they've decided that that they're going to become white nationalists. So I think you have to see the Republican Party as a coalition of people who believe in the white nationalism that Trump is pushing, and traditional Republicans that wanted the tax cuts and the regulatory relief and were willing to put up with this and use the DEI overreach as a justification for allowing the white nationalist part of their party. So I think they are in uneasy coalition with one another with the Republican Party, but I don't believe the Republican Party is fully on board with the MAGA agenda on that.
Right. The intensified fusion of evangelical Christianity and Republican politics under Trump has transformed the political theology of the right. How has this religious alignment shaped authoritarian tendencies, policy radicalization, and sacralization of political conflict?
Uh, I think the secular religious divide in America has exacerbated over the lifetime of many of us who were boomers, grew up in the 60s and 70s. There was a time when the Democratic Party under Carter, for example, was had an evangelical wing to it. I think the abortion issue and decisions created a separation. And then I think George Bush Jr. Definitely brought more of the evangelicals over to the Republican side. Trump is not a religious man. He pretends to be religious, but I don't think anybody seriously believes that this is a pious human being. Okay, so it is odd that perhaps one of the most secular and biggest sinners imaginable is the president for the religious right. But I think they see him kind of the way somebody getting a divorce sees their divorce lawyer. They don't care about that person's morality as long as they get the divorce. And I think Trump is that way. They know he's not a decent human being, but they like the fact that he stands up for them. And so they overlook the fact that he's anything but a religious man himself.
Right. Republican elites have alternated between embracing and distancing themselves from alt-right and white supremacist movements. How should we interpret this oscillation? Tactical ambiguity, strategic cooptation, or deeper ideological convergence?
I don't think it's completely resolved how far they're going to stay with this sort of white nationalism. I know too many educated Republicans that don't take that point of view. For example, at Stanford, one of the most powerful people on campus is the head of the Hoover Institute, who is an African American woman, Condi Rice, okay? And everybody respects her. And she certainly doesn't put up with, white supremacist beliefs. So I think it's an uneasy alliance. And as I said before, I think it's justified in the time being because there was a belief that Democrats went a little too far in trying to justify diversity, equity, and inclusion measures, and that affirmative action went a little too far, and that some people have been denied fairness in order to redress unfairness in the past. So I think there's a difference between Republican skepticism about DEI and, on the other hand, supremacist thoughts. So I think it's really the base and a small part of the base that really believes this. And I think it's an uneasy coalition, and I think it could be problematic at some point in the future, maybe the next presidential election.
Right. Drawing on your work on party autonomy, how has Trumpism altered the internal structure and strategic independence of the Republican Party? Has it hollowed out institutional authority or merely displaced it toward charismatic leadership and movement actors, especially within a nomination system that was reformed to democratize candidate selection, but arguably enabled populist capture?
Yeah, so there's definitely, again, an element that is peculiar to Trump and his very strong bullying methods that's enabled him to capture the party. But I think if we step back, we see that there are longer term trends that made it possible for him to do this. And certainly, right at the top of the list has to be social media. I think social media, we've seen, is a real tactic of bullying if you want it. Everything from doxing to, the ability to get people shamed, to mobilizing crowds instantaneously. All of these things have made bullying and intimidation much stronger, not only in politics, but in the life of our children and in our communities. So Trump was definitely a beneficiary of that. But there were also things that we did in political reform that weakened parts of the party. So in America, we think of the party as having three pieces. We think of the party in office, namely the partisanship of the office holders, the party in the bureaucracy, which is the people that are in the RNC and the DNC and the 50 state parties, i.e., that run the sort of bureaucracy of the party, and then the activists. And to make a long, complicated story short, what we've done in political reform is strengthen the activists. And we've known in political science for decades that the activists are by far the most ideological component of the electorate. And we've weakened the power of the office holders. You can see now that the Congress is so afraid of party primaries because the primaries do not attract all the voters. They attract only the most partisan activist ones. And so the control that the activists have over the primaries skews the party, both of the parties, to either the left or to the right. And the other aspect of this is that the Supreme Court has allowed wealthy people to spend as much money as they want. They've created almost limitless self-financing, and that helped Trump quite a bit. He was able to use all of his money to catapult himself into essentially into the primaries. There's now a lot more independent spending, and the independent spending essentially dwarfs now the money that's given to candidates directly. And so we're awash now in ideological money and in interest group money. So our inability to control campaign finance has definitely also helped Trump and made our situation much worse.
Right. The rise of executive-centered partisanship has weakened Congress and elevated the presidency as the primary partisan engine. Do you see this imbalance as reversible through institutional reform, or has it become structurally entrenched within the constitutional order?
Well, we'll know a lot more about the answer to this question over the next year as the Supreme Court has to decide how much of the emergency powers, the use of emergency powers to suspend normal processes, the use of impoundment activities, i.e., to decide when you come into office that you're not going to spend the money that was allocated by the previous Congress, or how much you can remove people in the bureaucracy that were not political people but were nonpartisan people. How much do you undo the reforms that we did in the progressive era to create a nonpartisan bureaucracy? If the court condones that, it'll be monkey see, monkey do, because the Democrats will take whatever powers that are given to the president to politicize everything and to use emergency powers and to undo everything that Trump is doing. You're going to see the Democrats do the same thing, which means there's going to be a lot more instability in American positions vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis trade, vis-a-vis climate change. You'll just get essentially will become much more schizophrenic and much more variable. And I believe ultimately that will undermine capitalism and investment and infrastructure. But whether we are going that way and whether it will be permanent is going to be decided by the Supreme Court over the next year or two.
All right. In your work on dependence corruption, you highlighted how financial flows shape representation, how the emerging funding ecosystems around the MAGA media, Christian nationalist donors, tech billionaires, and PACs challenge existing regulatory frameworks and deepen authoritarian tendencies within the movement.
So I do believe that America, because it has a very liberal interpretation of the First Amendment, i.e., because we believe that money is speech and that we can only restrict it under the narrowest purposes, namely to prevent quid pro quo corruption, meaning money that's given directly to a candidate, we've opened up the floodgate to a lot of money. And now that can still work if the money is equally on one side versus the other. And on many issues that's true. But what we're seeing, for example, when it comes to the digital currencies topic, for example, is that Trump has brought in lots of billionaires, tech billionaires that want to do meme coins and want to invest in large server farms that run in order to create value for the digital currency. And, you know, all of those things, I think, are directly related to not only corruption that comes from campaign contributions, but the fact that we've got Trump himself cutting deals for himself, investing in currency, making policy that then favors that. I think we're seeing in America now a level of corruption that we didn't think was possible after we did all the corruption reforms in the 70s. But I think it's at a level that's almost close to the 19th century in terms of people getting into office or getting into power and then using it to essentially make themselves richer. So this is a major concern, and I think there'll be a lot of us in the legal and the political science world that are going to be thinking about how we can strengthen the system against that.
Right. And lastly, Professor Cain, given the structural, ideological, and institutional transformations, what democratic guardrails or institutional reforms do you view as the most urgent to counteract potential authoritarian consolidation on the American right? Are there specific vulnerabilities, such as in-party regulation, executive power, or information ecosystems that should be prioritized?
I would say that a lot of people in my world of political reform are going to try to restore some of the institutions that we had, like the filibuster, i.e., supermajority votes that try to create bipartisanship. They're going to try to restore that. I think that just flies against the underlying culture in America right now. Where I think the court needs to really draw the line to save American democracy is on executive actions. That is, to what degree can the president act by himself by imaginatively reinterpreting existing legislation and doing executive actions? I think, secondly, emergency provisions. If everything's an emergency, then nothing is a democracy. And that's essentially where we're headed if we're not careful, because the political parties can pretty much say anything is an emergency, whether it's somebody getting beat up in a city or murdered, or it's immigration not being able to control it, or maybe it's the economy not going well. Everything can be an emergency, and therefore nothing is a democracy. And that clearly is a big hole that needs to be fixed. And then lastly, I think for both the United States and say within, as in the EU, there has to be an understanding that states' rights, the right of states to check the federal government, to be a laboratory of innovation, to act differently from the federal government. I think it's really important that the court continue to recognize the importance of state sovereignty as given to the states under the Constitution. So I think those are the most important things to do right now, and Trump has made it very evident that we need to shore up both the judicial interpretations and possibly some of the statutory and constitutional wording that associated with these problems.
Professor Bruce Cain, thank you so very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure.